Great. Okay, so let's make a start. Thank you everyone for making time on this Monday morning to learn more about how we as researchers might be able to not just inform, but to actually influence policy with the evidence that we generate from our research. Today's session is based on my new book, the Research Impact Handbook. No, it's not the Research Impact Handbook. On my new book, which is called The Researcher's Guide to Influencing Policy. So the idea here is that what we're going to do is, as evidence-based, based on these two books, as it is, hopefully, realistic. So the goal here today is for me to share what works, both from both the evidence and from my own experience. So I will be sharing a few stories, experiences, and critically to make sure that this is something that we are all able to actually do in the real world as part of a busy academic job. I'd like to start with a question, if I may. What is policy impact? So there are two elements to this, clearly. What do we mean by policy? But also, what do we mean by impact? And when we bring these together, where does that take us? There are a few wrong answers that I'm going to work through, because ultimately I want us to understand the difference between simply doing policy engagement and actually having policy impact. So, what is policy impact? So the idea of change I like, because what is impact anyway? It could be positive, could be negative. And I guess change has that same problem with it. It could be positive change, it could be negative change, but at least we get the idea of some kind of change. That makes kind of intrinsic, obvious sense. But there is this normative dimension to impact, the idea that ideally we are seeking a beneficial change, something that is going to benefit others. And of course, as soon as we realize that there is an element of subjectivity, especially in the policy domain. The majority of policies out there will have both winners and losers. So whether this is beneficial or not depends on your perspective. And that could be a political perspective, or it could just be what kind of social group do you sit in? Are you a small business owner? Are you a large business owner? How does that work for you in terms of Brexit, for example? Brexit being a really nice example of a nice controversial policy. Good for some people, not so good for others. So instantly we realize that there is going to be value judgments involved. And right from the beginning of today's session, I want us to begin engaging our own values and what we believe is right and wrong, therefore what we believe might be beneficial or not. But of course, it's not really just up to us to work out what is right for others. And this is going to be a core theme running through today's workshop. And a theme running through the book, that ultimately we have to work out what is going to be right for people out there and to connect and understand what some of the poorest, the most marginalized, the most oppressed in society might find beneficial for them, and not just what we think might be beneficial for them. So great, we've got a fairly good idea, I think, of what we mean by impact. And so let's just apply this then to policy. Of course, we generate evidence, and we hope that some of that evidence may be used to generate policy. But I'm going to suggest that good policy making involves far more than just evidence, and that we need to broaden our scope to think about more than just evidence. But more on that in a moment. I think implicit in this is the idea that, here John is saying it's about a government policy or some kind of government program. So we're moving from the idea that a policy impact has to be about legislative change, a change in the law, to the idea that this could be about some other thing, a government program. So no change in the law, but we have a program and we're now changing how that is targeted, for example, so it is more or less means tested, more efficient, helps the right people better, for example. This could be national policy, which is what we tend to think of. Of course, if you're in the UK, many of us are, we remember that many issues are devolved. So is that English policy, Scottish policy, Welsh or Northern Irish? But of course, it could be local policy. It could be international policy. This could be the policy of a company, for example, or an organization. We do things differently around here now. And so let's maybe think about policy more broadly. That's the idea that we have codified how things are going to happen. And there is some way of making that codified new way of doing things actually happen, whether that is an incentive to make it happen or some kind of regulation or stick that will enforce that now new codified way of doing things. And so if we think about policy in that broad term, we realize that, yeah, actually any organization can create a policy. And so we now broaden our target from the idea of national or international policy to the policies of organizations out there that we might be able to influence, who may actually have more ability to affect change than a government. And it's worth thinking broadly and deeply about that. I'm going to suggest, though, that we often think of a policymaker as a bit of a mythical being. It's this person that makes policy. And of course, the reality is that there is no one person that makes policy, not even a government minister. Actually, there are teams of different people within the civil service that will be part of that policy-making process. And we have our parliamentarians who will debate and amend and such like. And of course, we have all those people who are still probably civil servants, but are ultimately around the implementation, whether that's in an agency, but it could be in the police force, teachers and the like, who are ultimately implementing government policy. And so we have all these different people now that we could be engaging with. We could be in that kind of pre-policy, shaping something early stage, but it could be about an existing policy which isn't working, which we're making better. Or it could be about a policy that is great, but is not being implemented, and now we're helping with that. So what I'm hoping we're doing here is we're expanding this space and realizing that I can actually work in all of these different areas with a whole load of different kinds of organizations and people if I want to affect policy change. Now, I did give you a bit of a clue at the beginning, and I'm very pleased to see that nobody I have seen yet has fallen into the trap. But I regularly work with researchers who come to me with policy impacts that are actually not policy impacts. They have a policy brief. It's been downloaded thousands of times. They maybe even have evidence that it's been read by thousands of people. But how do I know who has downloaded that? Maybe that's my undergraduates because I promoted it in a lecture. Maybe it's people who are not relevant to policy in any shape or form. The evidence I have that people have read this, have understood this, is I took my policy brief to a webinar, a seminar. But how do I know who turned up, whether they actually had the ability to do anything with this? Maybe they were the right people, but how do I know they understood what I was saying? Maybe I spoke in impenetrable jargon and it just went over their heads. Well, now I've taken this to a select committee, to an inquiry. I've even been quoted in their report. Surely that's policy impact, Mark. And I have to say, well, maybe, but you're going to have to do a bit more work to find out if there is actually any real actual benefit from this, because a whole load of these committees actually go nowhere. There are great recommendations based perhaps on your research, but nobody ever does anything about them. And in fact, the whole thing appears to have been a waste of time. Maybe, however, some of those people in that committee, some of your audience in that webinar now understand something important that they didn't understand before. Maybe they have new skills, access to a new database, a decision tree, a decision support system. They can do things they couldn't do before. At that point, with a bit of digging, maybe I can argue that there is a benefit. It's small. And I hope that people will one day use that knowledge, that new skill, that new ability to actually do something good that will benefit society rather than just them and their professional life. and we will wait and see whether that impact matures. But the fact that I've been quoted in a committee report, an inquiry, this is evidence of engagement, not impact. And let's be very clear about that. Engagement is important, but it is the means to impact, not the end. And if our only focus is on generating policy briefs, infographics, presentations, committee hearing, all those kind of stuff, then we may just be generating a whole load of noise and wasting our time and everyone else's. We need to push this further, be more curious to find out whether there was a benefit, and keep along with this journey to see if we can actually transform this into something genuinely beneficial. This is designed to be too small to read because it is a confidential government document, a bit of work that I did to feed into a government document with some colleagues who are actually on the call here today. This is a bit of work for a Scottish government. And the question is, well, if we want to get to the things on the right-hand side of this diagram, the actual policy outcomes, the things that are good for society, then how do we as government get there? And they ask us to help them to design a government strategy. And so instantly, what is a strategy? Well, a strategy typically is a document that will headline potentially some existing and new legislative changes. It may or may not. It will also headline a whole load of other things that are designed to achieve some policy goals. And there's usually quite clear goals and some deadlines for achieving those goals. And to the left of this here, you can see that this does involve some new legislation that, in theory, will be headlined in that strategy when it is published later on this year. But that is the only actual pieces of policy change. All of the rest of this is stuff that you have to do to implement those policies, implement other policies. Some of this is within government's control, and actually some of this are other organizations, other groups outside the control of government who we are actually going to depend upon to deliver this stuff. And if they don't play ball, then you know what? You still don't get your policy outcomes. And I show this just to illustrate the complexity of policy systems and the fact that we're now moving out from this idea of policy as being something quite diverse to the idea that we have a policy community, which would be those civil servants, people in government departments who may be making policy, but also those people who are implementing this, the parliamentarians, people in government, but also in opposition. And we then have these broader policy networks, organizations that come in and out of policy influence as policy agendas intersect with their interests, who we may need to work with in order to either influence policy or enact policy to actually achieve real change on the ground. So to summarize what I'm talking about here, if you've been to my trainings before, you'll be familiar with my one-word definition of impact. It is simply a benefit. And when we ask ourselves, who are these people ultimately that are going to benefit, we realize that this is a little bit more subjective than we might feel comfortable with. We then have a definition here. This is from the Research Impact Handbook that builds in this value judgment that I started with, this idea that we're looking for something which is good. But of course, who gets to decide what is good? In this definition, this is the first peer-reviewed cross-disciplinary definition of impact. I've paired the word demonstrable that you'll be familiar with from Thunder and official technical definitions with the word perceptible to point out that perception really matters. And we need to ask, in whose eyes do we behold impact? And I think that there's a problem that I want to highlight at this point, which is that there is often a really cozy relationship between us as researchers and our policy colleagues, and that we can characterize this much of the time as one elite influencing another elite. And I want you to be aware at this point of your own positionality, your own privilege as a researcher. We are more likely, because of the evidence we sit on, and you can argue rightly so, but we are more likely to be listened to. we are more likely to get access to the people who can affect policy change than many other people in society, certainly your average member of the public. And so we now get privileged access as an elite to that policy elite. And together, we get to have these conversations about what a good policy might look like. And we assume, perhaps rightly, but perhaps not rightly, that our policy colleagues are doing the work to understand who are those other people that might have diverse views, who may be less fortunate than people like us, and to make sure that their views are captured. And they do things like consultations. Have you actually responded to a consultation? I don't know. If you have, you'll know they're online. Especially if you've tried to respond to a consultation that is not in your research field, you'll realize just how difficult this is. I tried to respond to one the Scottish Government put out recently about gay conversion therapy, which is an issue that I feel strongly about personally. And have no expertise in that area, just opinions as a member of the public, and was just completely confounded by all of the legal language. And of course, I had the inside knowledge that you can just respond to one question if you want. And I responded to the questions that I understood, that I had a view on, and not to the rest of them. But if you think you have to respond to them all, in fact, even if you get past the first question, I'll be surprised when you actually look at just the level of jargon. It was properly intimidating. I got a sense of actually what this is like. And there are still many people in my own personal network who are not even literate. And how do we get people like that and their views in? And I'm going to suggest that we perhaps should take on an additional responsibility to not just assume that policy elite are going to be able to do that work properly, and that we also ask ourselves what we can do to, at minimum, represent those perspectives and voices alongside our evidence. It's not about diluting the evidence, changing the evidence, but just saying, yeah, here's our evidence. And here are some views that pertain to this evidence that you might want to be aware of. And where we can, to actually give voice to those people and to use our networks to empower them and to bring them into the corridors of power themselves. And so for me, this book was an attempt to decolonize what for me is a really privileged space in which we typically have very limited awareness of our own privilege and, I would argue, responsibilities. I want to get you to think deeply about that. So let's pause at this point and pick a few questions. Maybe just one final slide, actually, just to summarize and keep this very nice and practical, because I want to go deep again after this. This is my typology of 10 different types of impact. Of course, you can come up with others, placing policy in the center to point out that, yes, we may be all about policy impacts here today, but on the journey to those policy impacts, we can already achieve impact if we have transformed someone's understanding and awareness of an issue, or we've built capacity or preparedness, or perhaps just changed attitudes. I recently worked with the Committee on Climate Change. They asked me to look at a report. I said, one of your key recommendations is not actually possible, and here's why. They eventually asked me to give them a call, and by the end of that call, the penny dropped, and they realized, oh, that's kind of embarrassing, isn't it? We can't really say that. No, you can't. It's not technically possible. Great. So, Mark, what do we say instead? And I'm like, I have no idea. I would love to have an answer to that question. All I know is you can't do that. But I would still argue the fact that this committee now understands something fundamental about how global carbon markets work. That is a win, that is an impact, and that will enable them to at least not do anything stupid and maybe to make better policy recommendations in the future. I have done training, impact training on how to engage with different groups in society to my policy colleagues. And again, I would argue the fact that they now understand some of these issues that I've been unpacking with you and can actually do better, deeper engagement with more marginalized groups more systematically. Great, that is still impact. We don't have those better policies yet, perhaps, but I can still argue that that is a form of policy impact. I do work on carbon markets and other forms of nature finance and the like. And ironically, I also believe in a post-capitalist degrowth world. And so some of the work I've been doing is working with my policy colleagues to put degrowth options on the table for ministers to say that, you know what, you've got a bunch of assumptions here that are boxing you in. And actually, some of these things are politically palatable that you could actually bring in and just widen that little box that you're in. And again, whether or not anyone goes to those options, the fact that I've changed those attitudes, I would argue that's a win. That is a policy impact. And of course, then how that policy changes people's decisions, changes behaviours, drives cost savings to the NHS, for example, environmental health or physical health, whatever that may be, towards the right-hand side. And of course, yes, that stuff takes time. But this is the issue space that we are looking in. And my hope is that I am opening your minds in more ways than one. So thoughts, perspectives, I think probably too long, too many of us to do lots of talking, but if you do want to speak, let's put a few hands up and we'll try and go through as many questions or reflections in the chat. Yeah, Stephen, and the fact that I am talking to people along these lines, you could argue that that is political. Should I be doing something like that? That's about my values. And what I would argue is that actually, no, I have some evidence of some options here that can work in a degrowth kind of context. And I think that it is worth changing your attitudes enough to look at that evidence rather than to dismiss the evidence because the evidence doesn't fit into a very small economic growth set of options. But there is a blurry line. And I want to explore this in more depth about where do you draw that line in terms of your values and how you enact them in these spaces. And for some of us, that kind of discussion is just off limits. That's wrong. And feel free to judge me for that, because in so doing, you are making your own judgments about what is right for you. And that's what I want you to come to in this. Thanks, Susan. How to work on changing the academic context and reward system to support the work needed to create deep and long-term relational networks to give voice to those who are currently excluded. And I agree that that is absolutely what is needed. And I've been also using my skills as I have them to try and influence Research England and the Research Excellence Framework as one of the things that is driving research culture and impact culture in the UK. And the research underpinning that is in that book, and there's also a peer-reviewed paper. So that's giving you free access to that. I believe we need some fundamental changes in culture. And we'd love to work with anyone else who wants to do that kind of thing. Yeah, so thanks, Charlotte. I work in the charity section. Being given time to talk to the people about the issues I've researched here is still a challenge. Yeah, and finding that time is ultimately the challenge. And I will give you, again, we don't have time to go into this in any depth, but I have a free training coming up towards the end of the year, I think in October, based on my book, The Productive Researcher. It is ultimately a book about getting better work-life balance, but it is also a book that I have used to take all of the time-saving tools that I started to develop to get more time for impact alongside my busy academic role to try and get more time for life as well as work. And I think that there are things that we can do in terms of changing our thinking about our priorities that can help make more time for the things that are actually important and in line with our values, so that we go and spend time with those people without feeling guilty. And we make some very clear decisions about the things that end up going as a result. And of course, it is always about trade-offs, but it's about a much more systematic and values-based way of making those trade-offs and becoming efficient enough to do the stuff that really matters. And for many of us, it is this stuff that really matters. Thanks, Neve. I think, did you make a couple of comments? And I've missed the first comment. There's just too many comments in the chat. But your second point is about recognizing tensions within the concept of giving voice to a group that you don't belong to, or if you're an atypical member in terms of your privilege or identity intersections. Some attempts to give voice end up actually reinforcing existing power imbalances and inequalities. Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to take a slow and careful, and I hope very much ethical approach to this. I'm working with Eric Jensen and colleagues from Institute for Methods Innovation at the moment. He's leading this paper. A number of you on the call have been part of this process because it's been part of our community of practice over the last year. And we've got a paper which I think has just been submitted, a paper about the ethics of engagement and impact. And they are fraught because there are so many well-meaning people doing things which are inadvisable that end up having more negative unintended consequences than they do good when we just rush in to try and give voice to people that are working in very sensitive, very challenging kind of contexts without being aware of that. And so I'm going to give you a few tools in the second half that can help you to take a very slow and careful approach to this. But that's a really nice comment. So thank you, Neve, for just bringing that to the fore. Sarah, nice and practical. If you're into this kind of stuff, great. If you're a participatory researcher, deploy this or invite some participatory researchers into your team to do this properly rather than trying to dabble and doing it badly. Yeah. But as a social scientist who regularly gets invited to be an impact add-on, let's do this respectfully, to invite some people to come in and do some actual social science, not just to be an impact add-on. Great. So a few people talking about metrics. We're doing a cut-down version of my training today, so I'm wondering if we have time to do this. But it is one of the most common questions that I get. How on earth do you measure policy impact? What a nightmare. And so I think what I'll do is I'll just very briefly signpost you to some stuff. There's an entire chapter on this in the book, also a chapter in the free research impact handbook as well. And so let's have a quick think about this. And it was also something that people built into your definitions at the beginning. So have a look at this website. So this is currently available for free through Sage Publications. It's a collaboration with Overton, and I think it's LinkedIn or your Orc ID or both, I can't remember, but there's kind of existing logins that you use, and it will then trawl through your publications and tell you if you have any policy citations. So for most mid to senior career researchers, you get multiple hits, but before you get very excited about this, it's worth digging into this. I think this is my one, and yeah, I do not have that many policy impacts. I wish. A lot of these, they're kind of reports that have been written for policy organizations that are actually just kind of research-based reports. Others, yes, this is policy, but when you look, you're actually being cited in some general preamble, and there's really no policy influence at all. And even when you do have that, you're going to have to do a bit more digging to get enough evidence that, yes, indeed, this was you. And the bigger problem that most of us have is that there are no citations at all, but we suspect our research may have influenced a policy. So do this in the background. I'm going to give you one more slide on how to evidence policy impact, and then we'll see if anyone's got anything interesting. In fact, stick it in the chat if you've got anything interesting that comes out of this, or problematic, actually. That does sometimes happen. I worked with a researcher recently whose research, it turned out, had been used by the gun lobby in America, entirely against her values. Yeah, look with caution. I hope you're sitting down. So here's my four-step approach to evidencing policy, just to cover off those questions right now. First of all, you need a smoking gun. So in this case, this is a budget announcement. There is something somewhere that looks like it might be my research. Okay, it's worth investigating this now. The first place I go next is my pathway. This might sound kind of contradictory because I said earlier we need to remember we're aiming for impact and not just engagement. But as I also said, your engagement is the means. So if that announcement was in fact down to you, you're going to find the evidence in that engagement pathway. So let's go to that pathway. And who knows, we wrote a policy brief, we did webinars, we did seminars, we kept putting this idea out there. And it was clear that people were picking this up in various kind of documents. In this case, we've got a Committee on Climate Change report, a different one this time. And so now, what is the chance that actually that wasn't me, given that I was all over this and people were clearly listening? Well, it's kind of circumstantial. So we are going to then get absolute proof for this with a testimonial. I like to do this in interview mode rather than just emailing people so that I can really probe and understand. And in this case, had I asked this DEPRA official, did she base the recommendation to Treasury on my research? She would have said, no, never heard of you or your research. Of course, I'd done step 2, so I was able to say, yeah, it wasn't that climate change report by any chance. And she was like, yeah, that's the recommendation that we then passed to Treasury. So I looked and sure enough, no citation. All we've got is my name in the acknowledgements. So I'd gone to the consultant who had written the report and asked them, so those 2 papers I sent you, did you actually do anything with them? And they sent me back the model that they used to generate the recommendations. And that's where I struck gold. And in gold highlight, you can see the 2 papers highlighted in their spreadsheet model. And I was able to show my policy colleague. So yeah, that's the report. Here is the evidence that recommendation was based on our research. On that basis, are you happy to say that you made the recommendation to Treasury on the basis of the climate change report, which in turn was based on our research? Well, yes, of course, because I can see that is true. But the final point is, well, great, that is evidence of some kind of policy influence, in this case, a budget announcement. But that's only so far. And what I want ideally is evidence not only of a policy that is made, but a policy that is actually implemented and does good. Because as I said, you may be responsible for a policy that does as much harm as good. And of course, it depends on whose perspective you look at. And so my final step is to look at implementation. What happened? And if it didn't work, great, you now know it didn't work and you can try and help get things back on track. And in this case, I'm working with a charity I work part-time for on a voluntary basis. And they've created a tracker, and we are now measuring the number of hectares restored and the greenhouse gas emissions saved in CO2 equivalents that now tells us what is the benefit to the global climate and to nature. So, thoughts and reflections on this. I realize I've gone through this very quickly, but is this feeling tractable? And did anyone find anything interesting? Yeah. So yeah, I tried out ChatGPT, maybe not very well, maybe not with the right prompts, but just to say, yeah, what is my impact? So I gave it lots of information about me, my research, various profiles, and then said, tell me what is the impact of my research, and it was a load of rubbish, completely meaningless. And I think this kind of goes to show this is not something you can, at least with policy impact, is not something that you can metricize or farm out to AI. It's going to take a bit of work and a bit of intelligence and a bit of detective work, following person to person to person to report, and piecing this all together. And this is a task I would argue is much harder than at least AI is currently capable of doing. Is it recommended to join forces with other scientists? Yeah,
I do recommend, I do join teams and help people to research their impact if there is some funding in it. And I can do this in a way that is credible enough to generate a peer-reviewed output. And I think it's always worth asking yourself when you're thinking about evaluating your impact, if you're an applied researcher in particular, whether there's a paper in that data. Collect that well enough with all the right research ethics now around that data collection. And there's maybe a paper in that or a part of a paper that explains how this great thing you're doing is actually working in the real world. And that is then intrinsically motivational. But of course, that could just be a collaboration with someone else who is interested in that. And yeah, you get a few citations. So some academic impact alongside your non-academic impact. And again, yeah, is that a mistake or is that something bizarre and interesting? I'll let you decide on that. I'm guessing there's going to be a bit of reading required there. Annabelle found a policy citation, but yeah, just a junior researcher, not the main author. And depending on your role in that team, that may still be something that you could legitimately claim, certainly to a funder. It is a bit overwhelming, I do agree. It's going to take a bit of time. And for most people, they're only going to go to the level of effort that I've just described there if they are asked to create a case study for something like the Research Excellence Framework or REV. Not typically just to report to a funder on an annual basis. So there needs to be a reason for that. If you can get a paper out of that as well, all the better. But yeah, something like Overton is a nice shortcut otherwise. Yeah, advice on evidencing attitudinal change. So if this is kind of key individuals, then this would be interview-based and a testimonial. But then I would actually be doing kind of social science. So there are various psychological questionnaires that you can use that are already kind of tested, calibrated, all of that kind of stuff. Or I could just work with a social scientist to design something from scratch. But assessing attitudinal change at scale and doing that well, I would argue, is a social science task. In fact, I'm mentioning social science. You'll see in the paper that I put into the chat that some of the most sophisticated techniques that I'm aware of come from the arts and humanities for assessing implicit change that are not explicit, that people find hard to put into words, for example. So some really great methods. And of course, for those of us who are more science orientated, there are as many quantitative methods as your imagination. Just get creative about thinking how you can use modeling, for example, to look at how the cessation of a damaging policy now is benefiting. Now, what would have happened had that policy continued? And let's look at various different scenarios, take a more conservative one, look at the difference between what we now see and that conservative scenario. And it's all based on models, model outputs generated by algorithms and the like. So get as creative as you can. And for me, it's about that creative link then firing off my researcher brain and getting me excited if I am going to go the extra mile. So I get some research outputs as well. Sometimes people will refuse to acknowledge you, and there can be political reasons for this. We don't want to admit that we've been working with researchers on this. We want to take credit for ourselves entirely. That's one motive. In other cases, this is just confidential. So there's something that happened, but you're not allowed to talk about the thing that has happened for various reasons. And yeah, depending on the sensitivities of that, then this could be about whoever your audience is, making sure that this is locked down, it's redacted, it's there are various non-disclosure agreements and things like that around it. But in other cases, and the more common one is just politics. This is about then working with others. So we're now working with, I don't know, this is a bit of farming policy. And now I'm going to work with National Farmers Union, who I worked with, who is now going to write a testimonial that talks about all the policy changes that have happened that we worked on together, that we influenced and how that all happened. And yeah, it's not maybe quite as credible as the policy official themselves that we would want, but it's better than nothing. So let's move on. So I'm going to go deep, facilitate one final discussion, I think. I want to wrap up, codify, but go deeper and facilitate some discussion around some of these quite difficult issues. So I said earlier that I believe there is no such thing as at least purely evidence-based policy. Now, that sounds like a controversial statement for me to make to a bunch of researchers, but it's actually kind of obvious when you think that actually the task of our policy colleagues is to take evidence from research, but not just from our research and our project. Let's just pause for a moment on this critical point, because I think a lot of us are traversing some critical ethics here when we do as our funder tells us and write a policy brief just about our research project to try and generate impact. When we listen to the editor and the reviewers of our article who in an applied journal say, we want you to tell us what are the policy implications of this research. And I now make suggestions about both national and international policy implications from a single study in a single system with a bunch of case studies or whatever it might be. And actually, how responsible is this? Should policy be based on single studies? No, this should be based on evidence synthesis. And so our policy colleagues have the training to know that they should not be listening to us if we are coming with our latest study and saying, you now need to do this. If they do that, they will flip-flop from each latest study to the next. Not because our work was wrong, but because the next people who come along use a different sample over a different time horizon, made different assumptions in their model, whatever it might be. And yeah, this is no way to make evidence. And so instantly we're realizing, okay, here's my evidence, but who else's evidence is there? And what can I do to help my policy colleagues do their job and do some of that synthesis? Let's do a rapid evidence synthesis. Or if I don't have time, a bit of narrative review that at least puts our research in the broader context, especially if our research is saying something quite different to the rest of the literature. We also then, as I was alluding to earlier, need to bring in evidence, and there will often be quite a different basis for this evidence, but evidence and perspectives from other people who are outside the research domain. So unions, mentions the National Farmers Union, for example, third sector organizations, leading charities in our sector, for example, who commission their own research, for example. But also just the perspective of community groups, faith-based groups, people who have wildly different opinions to each other and to us potentially. And to say, yeah, all of that stuff is valid. And even if we don't accept that as our task, that is the task of our policy colleagues in a democracy, at least, to say, yes, this is what the research says, but what do people think as well? And then as a result, we potentially, as a policymaker, make a decision to go against the evidence, as would be right in a democracy. So, for example, I've got colleagues, I'm not in this area myself, but they swear blind to me. They've given me paper after paper that says GM food is safe and fracking is safe. According to my colleagues, at least, yeah, we have no problem here. Evidence-based policy would be pro-GM and pro-fracking, apparently, just in terms of public safety. Let's put climate change aside for a moment. I'm not an expert to judge, but we know that the public are opposed. How right would it be for us to impose the idea of evidence-based policy? This now means that we live in a technocracy, not in a democracy. And of course, our policy colleagues have their own professional experience, their judgments that they will bring to bear on this as they weigh up these different strands of evidence and experience and perspective. And they are more acutely aware than anyone else of the political windows of opportunity that could get something through this parliamentary season, whatever it may be, or the constraints, in particular the political constraints under this government, but maybe not the next government, and the budgetary constraints. That means that, yeah, but not now, not with this budgetary settlement. That then helps you to now come up with them with better ideas that are actually more likely to be both politically and technically feasible. So what I'm going to suggest then at the heart of this approach is a responsible and a deeply ethical approach to policy impact that acknowledges all of this complexity. This is not a simple kind of pipeline where I produce the evidence and someone then delivers evidence-based policy that does good. This is way, way more complex, and I hope you're getting a sense of that complexity now. And if that feels overwhelming, then good, because that means I hope that you're going to stop, pause, learn, and go slowly, rather than rush into something with a simplistic approach. This is an approach now that puts relationships first and that thinks deeply about our relationships with our policy colleagues, that builds relationships of trust over time. Of course, that takes time and effort because people keep changing jobs. And you may have something which is a devolved issue across 4 countries in the UK, for example. But I'm going to suggest that a responsible approach is one where you know them, they know you. And this now means that you can have the kind of conversations necessary to adapt what you're doing to their context and to do this sensitively and effectively. But of course, those relationships I'm suggesting need to go beyond those cozy elites to those who are not within the elites, and to bring those people in as well. And finally, power, our positionality and understanding our own privilege, and where we can, thinking of ways in which we can give that away. And if you are like me, a professor, that may be about giving power away to your more junior colleagues. I've got a colleague who's in a research assistant position on the call today with me. And just a couple of weeks ago, we were in policy conversations in Edinburgh, and just giving her other postdocs on my team those opportunities to come along, to learn, to build their own relationships with these policy colleagues as a foundation for their future work as well, and mentoring them into this kind of stuff. And of course, more importantly, what we do to give power to the powerless in society. I'll finish with this though, because a lot of us are, and a few of you have already said this, feeling kind of overwhelmed. And I said, okay, let's welcome that as a way of taking pause and going slowly and more carefully and taking a more responsible approach. But you can take that too far. And there comes a point where you have to take your courage in your hands. And the problem is that most of us languish in what is described in this idea of imposter syndrome as the valley of despair. Where, of course, as a researcher, you know all the things you do not know. You are more aware of anyone else, of the gaps in our knowledge collectively, let alone in your own knowledge. So who am I to now give advice to someone who could make decisions that could affect everyone in the country? And your confidence vanishes before your very eyes and you do nothing. For me, the thing that motivates me most to crawl out of that valley of despair is to take a look back behind me to the peak of Mount Stupid, where I see a bunch of lobbyists who are very confidently spouting rubbish. Whether it's because they just don't know the evidence, or more likely, as I suspect, because they are turning a blind eye to the evidence because it doesn't marry up with their paymaster's view. And it is that then that enables me to climb that slope of enlightenment just enough to have the courage to put what evidence I have out there and to start putting out a different story that contradicts some of the most damaging misinformation coming from Mount Stupid, even if it's very narrow, just based on my PhD or whatever it is that I'm doing at the moment, this literature that I'm currently familiar with. And yes, there's more, but this is as far as I go now, and I start and I do something. And so my final question to you is, where are you on this graph? And what could you do to start climbing that mount? Not Mount Stupid, please. To start climbing the slope of enlightenment. We're going to start getting more practical and take you on a journey to start learning about a few different roles you can inhabit. We're going to go into a whole series of very practical tools and techniques. But for me, this ethical foundation is so important because we can cause untold harm if we just dive into this without thinking. Secondments and policy internships are a really great way of just slowly getting to learn the ropes and understand the pressures that our policy colleagues are under. I did one as an early career researcher in DEFRA, and yeah, I came out of that and then got a whole load of DEFRA contracts to do research directly into policy in that particular area. And it really started my journey to impact with that particular government department. So it definitely works, at least from my experience. So a lot of you just reflecting on where you are. And I guess I'm going to leave you with a thought. And this is a thought worthy of personal reflection, if I may, because of course that x-axis is about confidence. And ultimately that is the problem for a lot of us. As academics, there's a pathway to competence that we are following already. The confidence bit is where we struggle. And I'm going to suggest, this is material from my last book, Impact Culture, that the source of imposter syndrome is a gap between how we see ourselves and how the world sees us. And this explains why imposter syndrome is so common in researchers that want to achieve impact, and why want to achieve policy impact specifically, and why imposter syndrome is one of the key reasons that people never actually start engaging with policy. So there are two sides to this. And the first, of course, is that when we go into the policy domain, we realize that there are all these people who are now hanging on our every word, who think that we are the world expert in whatever it is, that we have the answers to their questions. And of course, I know that their confidence is misplaced. Yes, I know some stuff, but not as much as you think. And so that gap then widens as I look at what I know compared to their perception of me. And I just can't move. I get paralyzed by this. And so the answer, in part, I'm going to suggest, is actually about managing expectations, talking very openly about your limitations, about what you do not know, about the edges of your expertise, and being humble in that and really emphasizing, look, I don't know. I will have to go and check. I'm not sure. And these are the uncertainties. And for me, that really helps me to realize, okay, so now you know, I have a more realistic perception of where I am. Maybe I can work towards meeting those expectations. But of course, the other side of this equation is my own confidence. We're talking here about a gap between how the world sees us and how I see myself. And so the other work that we need to do is that inner work on my own sense of self-confidence, and ask why it is that despite the fact that I have my PhD now, despite the fact that I'm a professor now, or whatever it might be, I still don't have enough confidence in me. And what is the source of that? And can I do the deep work on that now? And what I tend to find is that that inner work meets with that expectation setting to a place where now, you know what, I can overcome imposter syndrome and start working with policy. So what I want to do in this next segment is to get you to start thinking more about your own research and the different roles that you might want to play. But certainly one breakout room coming up in this next segment so that you can begin not only thinking about this for yourself, but also in relation to the kind of quite different answers others might have to these questions and go a bit deeper with your colleagues. So 3 things we're going to look at. First of all, a question that we rarely ask ourselves: are we actually ready to engage with policy yet? And let's bear in mind that the answer might be no to that before we then move to, okay, so how do I want to do this? What approach do I want to take? And we're going to be thinking about the balance between informing versus influencing. And then finally, we'll have a think about the different kind of roles that you may want to play. and get you to do some individual thinking about that. And we'll have some plenary conversation about that as well. So there are 3 chapters in the book on this in part 1 of the book. And we're going to work through this fairly swiftly. But the key thing is that you're making this personal now. You're thinking about your own research. So I'm going to give you a 2x2 matrix. And I want you to, first of all, have a think about a part of your research that you think might be policy or relevant. So this could be one project, could be one paper that you have written or that you are writing, could be one theme within or strand within your research. Have a think about at least one area. Of course, you can have more than one, but at least one area that you think is policy relevant. And then ask yourself, how strong do you think the evidence is in this particular area? Or to what extent would you argue that the evidence currently is kind of limited, weak, or mixed? Secondly, I want you to think about the kind of policy problems that are relevant to this domain of your work. So, for example, I'm currently working with colleagues in my team on how to regulate carbon and other nature markets so that they are responsible. And yeah, I'm asking myself, is this a clearly defined policy problem with a clearly defined set of solutions? Or actually, is this quite poorly defined? And do I need to do a bit more work on the nature of the problem and its solutions? So, first of all, you may be lucky enough that there is strong evidence that you agree with your policy colleagues that there is a really clearly defined policy problem. You've got a series of different solutions, and you can now take a systematic impact strategy where you draw on both your own evidence and the broader evidence to evaluate each of those different options in turn and make recommendations accordingly. I would always argue to take this a step further and create something like a theory of change or a logic model. So that big complex diagram was effectively a theory of change that you saw earlier on. But something that is a little bit less simplistic than just, here is the thing you need to do. And let's also think about what could go wrong, what could go right, different contexts in which this might play out and such like. So it will take as sophisticated an approach as we can, but so far so simple. Of course, very often when we look at the policy problem as it's been defined and think deeply and critically about this, we realize that this has been defined by a group of people in power. That the framing of this policy problem will benefit certain people and their interests, but not others, because this policy framing points the finger at that problem, that group, at this narrow list of policy options. And as soon as we begin to problematize this and open this up, we realize that actually this could be framed very differently. And as a result, there could be a whole lot of other options that we should, in theory, be putting on the table. And so I would always invite you to and encourage you to be critical and to question any framing as given. And potentially, even in a consultation response, go beyond that framing and the options they are asking about to say, yeah, but you forgot this and you forgot these people, for example. And so we're now using our evidence to better understand the problem, as well as now co-producing no new policy options with not only our policy colleagues, but these broader policy networks of non-policy organizations that are involved in this area, and ideally directly with some of the people who are actually affected by this issue, so that we've got something that we know might actually work on the ground and meet real need. Of course, the problem that many of us will face, and I want you to be asking yourself already, because your quiet reflection time is going to be about, where do you sit? Maybe actually the evidence is quite limited. It's quite weak, or it's really mixed when I actually go and do the review work and look at this stuff. And if that is the case, but we still think that there's a fairly clearly defined policy problem with a clear set of options, then the first step I need to take is to do some evidence synthesis. What actually is out there? And this was the beginning of my work on peatlands, which led me into peatland carbon markets and beyond, was to say, well, policy has been paralysed in this area for decades because the research community are not speaking with one voice. And yet, nobody's doing the synthesis work. Part of the problem for that is that we're all collecting different data in different ways, reporting it differently. And we've been doing work on that as well. But the policy breakthrough came through working with an NGO to create a commission of inquiry to look at that evidence and say, yes, the evidence is mixed, but here are the areas where the evidence is clear and everyone is speaking with one voice and where you can start to do some policy action. And that was the beginning of everything that then followed. Of course, an evidence synthesis very often identifies the fact that there is not enough evidence. And if that is the case, then that your task now is to gap fill, and this will be a fairly targeted approach if you're taking a systematic research strategy. But again, I would always encourage you, if you think that there is a problem with the evidence, don't just go systematic, although that's always a nice, easy place to start. And there's a paper in that. Go relational as well and start asking yourself whether or not you accept that framing, whether these are indeed the only options, and get curious. And on this left-hand side, this is all for me about curiosity. And of course, there's a time thing in here as well. There's risk. You're going to have to talk to people you might not normally talk to. So this is a choice. But now we potentially can begin to co-produce our research with the people who might ultimately help us come up with benefits for them. I think a lot of us, and I would argue probably too many of us, are researching the problem. And that tends to be where the majority of research lies in most of the policy issues that I work with. We understand the problem very well. What we don't understand so well is what the options might be, what the solutions might be. So typically we need more research in that space. But yes, let's do the research on them both. And I think what I'm advocating for here is that you do deeper, more critical work on the questions, on the problem, so that you're asking the right questions for your research and you come up with better solutions. This relational research strategy, does it include engaging people with very different values? I'm thinking of work in relation to reproduction in general, including abortion access. And I'm going to say that really depends on you, to the extent to which you feel capable of doing that, the extent to which you are willing to do that. And your appetite for risk as well, depending on who these people are that you have to engage with. So all of this stuff is optional. I know many researchers who are very content to remain within their value bubble and keep things entirely safe. I think as long as you are aware that you are in a bubble and you don't claim that this is reality, then that's okay. And that's a safe place to stay. But when it comes to interacting with people with very different views, that's something that I try to do. And I think there's quite an interesting spiritual journey that you can go on. So I'm in a evangelical Christian church fellowship, despite the fact that I have very different views to everyone in my Christian network. Around gay rights in particular, and trans issues and such like. And I talk openly about it. I once publicly prayed against a homophobic prayer in church, just to try and balance things out. And for me, that is a huge tension. But a tension that for me is a spiritual path to work out how can I love without judgment and interact with and be friends with people who have radically different views and values in some cases to me. So it's up to you whether you want to do that work, I would suggest, and then it's uncomfortable work. And I guess one final thing I'd say is that, of course, in some cases, this has risk involved. I was once invited to write one of these kind of government reviews. It would have been the Reid review on a very controversial issue. I was flattered that they'd asked me, and yet I declined it on the basis that this controversial issue had some very powerful and rich lobbyists who had a reputation for dirty tricks campaigns. And the chief scientist had gone off on long-term sick after they targeted him and then his family, and it impacted his mental health. I have fairly fragile mental health at the best of times. I have three young children. I decided, you know what? Yes, that would be great. Yes, it would be the right thing to do. Yes, I could make a difference, but no, that's not for me. I'm not capable of that. So I think, yeah, I just want to validate that it is very much your own choice for your own reasons. So Harriet, we need not just more evidence, but better evidence. And we need to think about how synthesizable our evidence is as well. What do we do about policy colleagues who have a natural physical science training, who are more on the objectivist side of epistemology? So they view knowledge and what constitutes valid knowledge and evidence as something which should, in theory, be objective, independent, neutral, all of those kind of things. And qualitative research tends to be quite different in terms of its epistemology, more subjectivist. And on that basis, many objectivists dismiss qualitative research. Working in the environments area, that's a big problem for me in terms of the training of many of the policy officials, agency staff, and such like that I work with. And so I do two things. I'd be interested to hear, maybe right in the chat, but I don't have time to go into too much depth. What do other people do? The first thing is that I tend to do mixed methods interdisciplinary projects where I've got some quantitative data, I've got some maps, I've got some models, all of that kind of stuff. And then I integrate my qualitative work into that heuristically. And then secondly, do some education work around the fact that, yes, this is a model, but that's the point. This is not absolutely certain. These are scenarios. And actually equally valid alongside all of this quantitative data are these perspectives. And actually, this is what now gives you the added depth and rigor that enables you to spot issues that the quantitative data alone will not allow you to spot, so that you don't make mistakes that require government U-turns. This is critical information that you need. So it's about giving them what they need as a way in, but then also doing a bit of education around how important qualitative data is for making good policy decisions. A few people, Edzia, struggling to place yourself on the grid. Don't worry too much about this. I'm going to move on. But for those of you who are realizing I probably need to do more research, if nothing else, I need to go and look at the literature and work out how strong or weak or mixed is that evidence. And I've got a task to do here. If that is the case, then that's a win for me, that we don't just figure I'm going to go out and achieve impact from my latest study. We're going to embed this within a much broader understanding of the literature, of the evidence. So great, go and do that work. That may then turn into something much more. So let's go to my slides. So step one is an evidence synthesis. In the book, you'll see lots more on the different kinds of synthesis that you can do. That often then means that I realize, yeah, we need more new evidence. The first place I go to is my current research program, if I have that, and I ask, could I adapt this to get the data we need? And of course, if the answer is no, then I need to apply for funding, but I would always start with, is there some existing data that I could apply for funding to analyze before, as a last case, as a last resort, I move to collecting new primary data. This is a figure from the book that is a bit of a decision support tool that will help you to think through the kind of different methods that you might want to use, depending on the kind of questions you have, but also based on your epistemology. And we're going to have a think now a little bit more about that particular question. So sorry that was a bit fast, but you've got that in the book to look forward to. So this is where we're going to move into a small group discussion. And if nothing else, I need you to all have a sense at the end of this as to whether you want to inform or influence. And if you're coming in having some experience already in the policy domain, I want you to start codifying, categorizing, and thinking more deeply about why it is that you tend to gravitate towards informing or influencing. And we're going to think about a few different ways in which we can do each of these two approaches. So 2 by 2 again. And first of all, I need you to get a handle on how proactive or reactive you want to be, and to what extent for you engagement is about knowledge exchange or knowledge transfer. Those of us who are more on the objectivist side of the spectrum may be more comfortable with a more neutral, independent, kind of far distant knowledge transfer type process. We'll speak a bit more about that in the third and final of these 2 by 2s. But critically, the other reason that you may gravitate towards the left of this is pragmatic. It is simply that you don't have time to be proactive enough and to make time for two-way conversation. And that is a legitimate answer. And so I want you to think not only about what you would ideally like to do, but also just think about reality here. Because being proactive means that I don't just wait until the consultation comes out. I am looking in between consultations to identify if I think there's a question that nobody is yet asking that they should be asking, because this is critically important. And I'm reaching out and I'm saying, what about this question? Have you thought about what could go wrong here? And I make room for that two-way dialogue, which can be kind of nerve-wracking as well. What if I don't know the answers to their questions? So yeah, that might seem like the best way to go, but actually, is that for you? I want you to think about that. Secondly, we have a question about the extent to which you want to take a questioning and inclusive approach to your engagement versus a more pragmatic and necessarily exclusive approach. And again, nobody aims to be exclusive and to cut people out, but this is pragmatic. And this is what many of us have to do because we have other things that we need to do. And so I want to again validate that it is entirely appropriate to take a pragmatic approach and to only focus on engaging with a small number of people and organizations, as long as you take a systematic approach to that. And we're going to look at that after the next break. So nothing wrong with that, as long as we're systematic and we have reasons for why we have chosen these people and not those people. But of course, if we've got time, then ideally, I want to be more inclusive. I want to engage as many people, as many perspectives, and particularly think about those who are more marginalized and to bring them into this process. And as you can see, so I just dive in here, we may start, I'm going to suggest, in expert informer mode as a fairly simple and low risk approach. This is low risk, both in terms of your time, but also your reputation, in terms of things that could go wrong. So ask yourself, yeah, is that me? Is that what I currently do? And why? Or if I'm not yet engaging, is this something that I'm gravitating towards? Is this something that I would like? And I want you to then discuss that in your small group. And so as an expert informer, this is more one way. So I'm going to respond to a consultation. I might take it as far as talking at a committee or inquiry where I might have to answer questions, but writing opinion pieces, policy briefs, I can put them out. It's much more one way. It's done, dusted. I hope for the best. It may go nowhere. It's perhaps not as reliable as a form of generating impact, but at least I've started, at least I'm trying, and there's a chance of impact. Of course, if I have more time and more of an appetite for risk, then I could take a facilitating informer approach. Now, I'm going to, yes, write a consultation response. Yes, go and give evidence to a committee, to an inquiry. But I'm now going to try and give voice to those who have been affected alongside my research evidence. So yes, here's the evidence. But it's worth you being aware that that evidence is going to land very differently for different groups. So this evidence will work in terms of delivering your policy outcomes, but there will be winners and losers, and here are the losers. That kind of stuff is incredibly valuable for our policy colleagues. And now I would argue that that informing approach is even more valuable. The first consultation, in fact, that I wrote was in this mode. We were doing interviews with gamekeepers, landowners, farmers for our research. And we discovered there was a consultation that was relevant. And so I spoke to the team doing the consultation, and I said, look, we're doing this research. Could we create what I described at the time as a multi-stakeholder response? And they were like, yeah, go for your life. And it was a great motivator for people to engage, because I was saying to them, we will be quoting you verbatim, anonymously, of course, in our consultation response. And great, now we have a voice. And many of the people we were interviewing were not literate. These are people who are not going to respond online to this consultation. And they had that voice. And the feedback I got was that it was one of the most useful responses they got, because alongside our presentation of the evidence, we also had this presentation of the lived experience of people in these landscapes around these issues. If we had even more time, though, we may move into influencer role. And first of all, we're going to take this more pragmatic, exclusive approach as an expert, where I accept that, yeah, I'm just going to primarily work on the basis of my own evidence as far as I feel comfortable. So this is what keeps this nice and safe. Don't have to go outside my own expertise, my own domain. But I am now going to be trying to be much more proactive, much more two-way in the kind of ways in which I do this engagement. So it's much more about webinars, seminars, one-to-one meetings, things like that. So people get that evidence, but I focus primarily on my own evidence. And if I then integrate in these other voices, the other perspectives, then that would be that facilitating influencer. And one of the things we can do as a researcher at this point is to use our convening power. As researchers, we are often trusted by people across a debate who don't necessarily agree with each other, or who wouldn't necessarily work with each other. And we may be able to get those people to work with us and to integrate those perspectives, create alliances, coalitions, or at least join those alliances and coalitions, and now together achieve things that we would never be able to achieve alone. And in both of these facilitating roles, just to finish up here, it's worth pointing out that because this is now a team-based approach, that whilst it might seem like this is more time than you have, this is now a team-based approach where I have a policy officer. I have someone who is actually paid to do this stuff. I've got people now designing my policy briefs for me. I can actually achieve way more than I could achieve alone, working in more expert mode, because I'm working with others. In terms of expert or facilitating, influencer or informer, that's your question. And just listen to other people's perspectives, because they may be very different. And the question is, why? Why do you do that? Why are you interested in that? Get curious and see what that does to your own perspective. So I'm going to give you all a poll at this point. And the question is, informing or influencing? No, you may not be able to answer this, because the answer is actually not one of these, but actually two of them, three of them, or I'm still not very sure. And in that case, please write in the chat. But if there is one that is very much in the lead for you, it'd be really interesting to see what kind of spread we have as a group. And this is also designed to help you come to that point of decision if you can. And so, sharing the results, what is interesting and actually unusual in my experience with this training is that it is the two facilitating versions of this that are in the lead. the facilitating informer, the facilitating influencer. I'm clearly getting better at selling this idea that we need to go deeper, we need to be more critical. But of course, there are very legitimate and important reasons to stick with your expertise. And I'm going to suggest in particular, I want you to think about your career stage here. And for many of us, this is about starting as an informer, starting in expert mode, in recognition that I have limited expertise, limited confidence. I'm going to build from there. And so one thing we can think about is the journey I might want to take. And maybe that's something that some of you have spoken about, in fact, in terms of the journey you have taken, if you have experienced, and how you now switch between different approaches depending on the kind of work that you're doing. So yeah, Helen, actually just saying, yeah, there's an aspiration. Actually, you're thinking that's maybe where your line manager should be, that is quite different to where you currently are. And I think that's very common for a lot of us. And it's confidence holding you back. Also, I think very common and legitimate. And so for me, this policy domain is high risk. If you get this stuff wrong, then there are potentially really big negative unintended consequences. And this is not designed to freak you out, but to say, yeah, you know what, if you don't have that confidence, don't go outside your comfort zone. Just slowly grow that comfort zone and go slowly as you build expertise, experience, confidence. And we'll look at a number of different tools, techniques you can use, many of which are very easy starting places for you after the next break. But I think the great thing is to say, yeah, this is where I am at the moment. I can do this. This is where I'd like to go, but I'm not going to go there until I've got the confidence for that. And so just to finish reading your comment, it's not that I don't know my stuff. It's more that, one, I need to get in the room, and two, I need to get the delivery of the messaging right. And there's, I think there's a chapter in the new book, also a chapter in the, certainly in the Research Impact Handbook on how to present with impact. So definitely a lot of stuff we can learn, skills there in terms of pitching policy ideas in both an evidence-based and persuasive way. So lots of things to learn. And I think just being aware of, yeah, there are skills I need to learn, and let's go and do that work. Great. So Stephanie saying that increasingly the sense that you're kind of being pushed to work with these networks of people, other organizations, etc., to kind of think big, do big. Yeah, great. But collaboration can be a problem, and especially when you're working with commercial entities that have got commercial interests and sensitivities, where you're working on really conflicted, controversial topics. That whole alliance building, collaborative thing can be really fraught. So yeah, it's a nice reality check there. And again, we may aim towards that and not quite get there for good reasons, and that's okay. Yeah. Okay, Charlotte, not sure where to start, and we're going to go straight there with a tool next. That's our next task as it happens. So the idea was for you to do the majority of that conversation in the small group. And I want to finish now by getting you to think about one final 2x2, a bit of reflection on this, and to vote again. Then we'll take our break and we will be relentlessly practical to the end. What specific role are you going to play? And then the practical techniques, methods, and the like, the tools will fall into this. So we're starting now very explicitly with an epistemological gradient, objectivity versus subjectivity. And you will hopefully quite quickly know roughly where you sit in terms of your discipline, your training, the approach that you take to knowledge and evidence. And then secondly, how policy responsive and close you want your working relationships to be versus how just policy relevant rather than responding to proactively all the time, and more distant you would prefer to be. And again, in that bottom left quadrant is the easy and safe place to start. And this role of critical friend that you may be familiar with from the wider literature on this subject, if you're into that. And it's this idea that now my task is to hold my policy colleagues to account, to point out where there could be problems, to provide scrutiny of policy. This could be in consultation type mode, in opinion piece type mode. It could just be reaching out and emailing people. But you can stand in judgment over certain things with that objective knowledge. And necessarily, you need to be distant, because that objectivity, that independence, that neutrality, that is your power. That is why people come to you as a researcher and why you are listened to, and you need to protect that. Is that you? And if that is you, of course, there are other roles you can inhabit, but this is one of the most comfortable roles to inhabit if that fits. Secondly, though, we're going to start moving up now to being a little bit more policy responsive and working more closely with our policy colleagues. In expert mode, this is based on my own research primarily and the research that I'm familiar with, to now work to really help define the problem and as many different options as possible. Whether or not we necessarily agree with them, that's not the point, because we're taking a much more objective approach to this. It's not about our values or what we think, but we are as objectively as possible laying out the solution space for our colleagues. In facilitating modes, we're going to take that more questioning approach in terms of the problem framing, the different options, and potentially layering in. Well, this is a political question, and ultimately this is then about value judgments, and let's have a think about how this plays out in terms of those values, and maybe even a bit of my own values, controversial as that may seem to some of us. And finally, this is as close as it gets. For some of us, that's deeply problematic. There's this Haldane principle, the idea that research and policy should be independent of one another. This is wrong for some of us. And for others, this is just obvious. Why on earth would you not do this if you want to achieve impact? I need to co-produce my research and the policy options I come up with my policy colleagues to ensure that they are genuinely relevant and responsive to the issue space, but also all of the constraints and opportunities within that policy context. And again, we can take more of an expert or facilitating mode, and that's whether it's kind of mono or interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, or whether this is actually transdisciplinary now, where we are doing that research not only ourselves and with our academic colleagues, but with our colleagues from policy and practice as well. And finally, we have this role of advocate and campaigner, and these tend to go together. And of course, we can switch between these modes. And so for me, this is something that I will only use where I've got a particular issue that I'm working on, where there is some kind of very clear right answers in terms of both the evidence and the morals of something. So climate change would be an example of this. I could present a load of different economic pathways, which are all about economic growth and polluting the planet. Or actually, I could say, yeah, I am a climate researcher, and yes, I have made a few value judgments and decisions here. I am presenting you with the evidence of what you can do if you believe climate change is real and you want to tackle climate change. And for me, there's nothing controversial about that framing, but of course it may be for you and will be for others. And then I will advocate based on that evidence, solely based on that evidence and whatever else I can bring in around that evidence. But I'm saying, look, here, there is a clear option that the evidence is pointing towards, that it looks to me like the right thing to do. I want you to think about this very carefully. And I'll do that internally. Where that doesn't work, you can then take a campaigner role, and this is now about working externally. This is then working with other organizations, with the media and the like, to put that public pressure on government to say, why are you not looking at this very obvious answer to this problem that the evidence supports and that is clearly the right thing to do? And for some of us, we run a million miles away from this. For me, the campaigner role, in terms of any front kind of facing role, terrifies me. And so I say no to all media engagement in terms of live media engagement because it terrifies me. But there's lots of colleagues who like doing that. And again, I'm just working with my own preferences as much as anything else here. Work with what works for you and run away if you're frightened. That's fine. And this could be moral fear as well as anything, the kind of anxiety that I'm talking about there. Yeah, for some of us, this is just totally wrong. For others, to not be a campaigner would be fundamentally wrong. Where do you sit? And in the chat, it's not that simple, which isn't from any of us. And Vera very eloquently talking about this. Same for me, Vera. I know you didn't misunderstand the exercise. Because we can play any of these roles, and it depends on the needs of the people we are trying to help. Let's see what else. The final outcome we're hoping to achieve, and the levels of readiness or understanding of the problem or challenge that we're trying to identify, address, or find solutions to. And in fact, there's some nice research on this, participant observation work of third sector organizations in meetings with policy colleagues, watching them adaptively switch roles within a single meeting. It is absolutely possible to be adaptive. We've simplified this somewhat as an exercise, so apologies for that. Very few of us, comparatively at least, primarily going in advocacy or campaigning roles, which is fairly common. Fewer than typical in terms of critical friends, from my experience, always a comfortable starting point, and a surprising number of us in that collaborator role. So as close as possible, basically. And that is my comfort zone personally. That's what I like doing. But of course, it becomes uncomfortable when I discover how long it takes. And so for pragmatic reasons, often I will switch into other roles and then, when necessary, switch into advocacy. And absolutely, when necessary, as a last resort, into campaigner mode. Good. So at this point, my hope is, pulling this all together, you've got a sense of, am I ready yet? And if not, what do I need to do? What kind of approach am I gravitating towards, whether that's informing or influencing? And my hope is that in turn has shaped your decision about the roles that you want to gravitate towards, that you want to play, or your understanding of why you tend to play the roles that you do play. Now, being aware of this, we can start to think very practically about how we might engage with things like email lists for consultations. Great, I'm going to put as many as I can into my diary. I'll manage my time. And for me, I managed to make about 50% of them. That's just real life. Influencers, I might reach out to my contacts based on their interests and start to co-produce an impact plan. And more on that in a moment. Critical friends, campaigners, perhaps for me, the comfort zone is more around identifying these organizations I can work with to build those alliances and to hold our policy colleagues to account. And then finally, brokers, it's about identifying groups with different perspectives that I might need to represent so that I'm as holistic as I can in the evidence that I put forward. And for the collaborators amongst us, it's again all about that impact planning, but doing it as closely as we can with those who ultimately will benefit. And that's ideally not just our policy colleagues, but far beyond that. And so we're going to look at a few of these, and we'll get much more practical in terms of some of the actual tools, techniques in this final segment. As I said, this is a cut down version of my full training, so we won't look at everything. But to start with a metaphor and a word, ultimately, what we're trying to get at with our approach in these tools is a more empathic approach. So I went to London with a colleague and a sign that read "Smile," and we grinned at random passers-by to see what would happen. The result of this experiment was that it turns out Londoners are very friendly, as you can see, and the majority gave us big grins back. And we did this to illustrate this metaphor, that good ideas spread like an infectious smile. They spread through the warmth of empathy, of human connection. Those 5 principles are from my Research Impact Handbook, and this theme of empathy runs through both it and my new Influencing Policy book. But for many of us, this doesn't come naturally. And I'm going to argue it's a skill And it's a skill, it's something we can practice and we can get better at. And so I'm going to give you a tool. This is my 3I analysis tool. We have this under review at the moment. It's a peer-reviewed paper. And I call it 3I analysis because this is technically a stakeholder analysis. And I have published a lot on stakeholder analysis in my early career. But more recently, and this has been a project that many of you have been part of because we co-produced this paper as part of our community of practice, we've been thinking about whether we should reconsider our use of this term if we want to decolonize language within research. And so I call this a 3I analysis after 3 words which are criteria beginning with the letter I. Who is interested or not, we'll come back to the or nots. Who has influence, either to facilitate or block my impact, and who ultimately is going to be impacted, either positively or negatively. And so we're looking at both sides. We're taking a critical approach. This is not just about how can I achieve the maximum impact with the most obvious group. We're thinking much more critically and asking these why questions. And we do so in a really systematic way. This is the tool. I'm going to give you a link to this. Instructions in this link on how to make this your own. So you integrate this into your own Google Sheets. Also, another link to my impact planning template. Many of you have seen this before, so we're not going to go into this in any depth. I want to focus primarily on how you can use this 3I analysis in a policy context. So here's a worked example, and I want to share a story from this worked example to illustrate some of the challenges, but also some of the ways in which we can practically put this into practice. I said I'd come back to the or nots. The critical innovation in this 3I approach compared to a traditional stakeholder analysis is that we don't just look for the organizations and groups that are high interest and high influence, which often then marginalizes those who are not that interested for good reason often, who have no power. By definition, these are the marginalized and the oppressed, and yet who could be impacted more than anyone else. And so we have a moral obligation to identify and then work out how we can engage with those groups. And I think it was Charlotte who was saying earlier on about just this need to be really critical and think carefully about how we engage with groups like this and give them voice. This tool is your stepping stone to begin to, first of all, understand who these groups are, but secondly, to understand a bit more about their needs, their constraints, the challenges they're facing, so that we go in sensitively. And the first step after having done a 3I analysis is to actually reach out and have some one-to-one conversations with representative bodies or just anyone that I can find who is willing to talk to me to find out more. And only then do we start actually planning for policy impacts based on those conversations where we can, even co-producing that work with them. If you do this and you discover, no idea where to start, Mark, completely clueless, great, that's awesome information. Now I know I need to bring in some other academics who are more engaged than I am, who've got a bit more experience. I bring in some of my colleagues from professional services who do this kind of stuff as their bread and butter. An engagement officer, whether it's policy or public engagement, an impact officer, great. I maybe even bring in a few colleagues from outside academia. And now together, in workshop mode, we get the information we need, and we can now go in, not blind, bull in a china shop. We go in sensitively and we have those conversations, and we then slowly take it as it comes. Now, the common question I get at this point is, but how do I find that person now? I worked out it is DEFRA in my case. Who is the right person? How do I talk to someone in DEFRA, a government organization? Well, the first step is I would go to the government website. There could be an organogram, there could be a directory. In my experience, it's very patchy. Some organizations have good contact information, others it's very opaque. So the next place I go, perhaps surprisingly, is LinkedIn. LinkedIn's superpower is its search function. So if you have a decent network, then this can be incredibly powerful. So it works for me really well, having been on the platform for some time with a fairly big network that's relevant to my policy impact. If you're new to the network or you don't have a big network, then you need to find someone like me who has a relevant LinkedIn network. So you're now going through your academic networks to find that person, and you're asking them the question. And at the same time, I'd be asking those people, do you know anyone in DEFRA? Could you introduce me? And that's exactly what happened with this screenshot. Someone came to me to say, at the time this department was called BAYS, was its acronym, and they were saying, do you know anyone who works on climate change in BAYS? I was like, no. But let me look at my LinkedIn. And when I did, it turns out I had 4 connections. And I looked at connections of them and then connections of their connections. I was able to identify 713 people by name with job title working on climate change. I screenshotted the first 2 pages, said go and Google them, and job done. There are paid directories and consultants that you can work with, and I'll let you do your own thinking about the ethics of paying someone to connect you with people like this. In fact, the story that I was going to tell, I'm going to have to do briefly because I want time for our breakout room sessions. But to cut a long story short, the research I was doing on peatlands that was trying to create a peatland carbon market that would pay now for the first time with private money to fix peat bogs for climate change and nature. It had to be reframed through successive governments that were for and against the kind of work that I wanted to do with this charity, a conservation charity, including working with ministers who were climate deniers. But each time we were able to reframe this, the whole time saying we are working as a conservation charity who believes that climate change is real and we're doing this for nature. But have a look at this mechanism we're proposing. As a Conservative government, maybe you're interested in these public-private partnerships and getting more private investment in. So that pro-Brexit minister, perhaps you're interested in the fact that this mechanism could put more money in hill farmers' pockets than the EU can and help save the sector from the disaster that is being predicted for that sector under Brexit. And I would argue that all of this is legitimate reframing for influence based on the evidence, because at each point in that journey, we are being very clear about who we are, what our evidence base is, and we're not changing any of that, but we are framing the messages so that we headline the things that are going to be of interest to that minister, to this government, to keep the momentum going we started the research in 2005, that policy mechanism was launched in 2015, and that is often how long it takes. And this, of course, then raises an interesting question. What is the difference between influence and manipulation? How far can I go legitimately in terms of changing that story, reframing and reframing to different people? And at what point do I actually cross a line? And I'm going to do an exercise right at the very end to get you to start thinking about those moral red lines, because the deeper we engage, the more likely we are to come up against those red lines, and we need to know where they are so we can stay on the right side. But what powers us to do that is that 3I analysis. I now understand their interests, and so I can simultaneously be engaging with different organizations with very different messages that are still legitimate and influence, in my view, as long as it's evidence-based and we are still clear about who we are and what we're trying to achieve, and we're hiding nothing. But still, this is the bit you're going to be interested in and see where that goes. Now, I said I wouldn't take too long on this because I think many of you have seen this before, certainly if you've been to any of my other trainings. This is my impact planning template. The key thing is that we don't do this in our ivory tower. We do this at minimum after having done that 3I analysis and had at least 2 or 3 conversations with real people outside the academy. And this impact plan is now informed by that research we've done in our 3I analysis and those conversations. And in an ideal world, there's an element of co-production and we can workshop something like this. And this now is becoming much, much more concrete. And of course, it is our policy colleagues and people in that community group or whatever who are going to identify the risks, what could go wrong, so that we now go into this much more clear about what we want to see, which we now see marries up with what people on the ground actually want to see, and we see and hopefully avoid the things that could go wrong. And as we do this, we start to build coalitions, alliances, teams. And this is now something that might seem, at this point, completely unachievable to you. But by the time you've actually got to this point and co-produce this is no longer just your impact plan. This is a shared impact plan, and it's you and a bunch of other people trying to achieve this. And then amazing things become possible. So yeah, that's what we're going to do at the end. We'll come back to that. Any thoughts or reflections on this slow, systematic, empathic approach? And then we'll move into our breakout room exercise. So thanks, Neve. Does such reframing have the potential to damage your cause or goal if the reframed rationale becomes public and it's felt to be in poor taste or cynical, and then spun by those who oppose your goals? Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and I think it is worth thinking about that. And I do think about that in particular when I'm working on contested issues where I've got people who are opposed to each other, because there's a really kind of, there's a real tension here where I'm trying to communicate to them, look, I am on your side, and I want to help you to achieve these particular things, but I'm also on their side and I want them to achieve these things as well. And for me, it's about being as transparent as possible, so that people don't then discover, hold on a minute, you're working with our enemies. Who are you? And I think with any kind of conflict of interest type scenario, transparency is always a key. So I'm going to get people kind of hooked in and interested by headlining the thing that is relevant to them. But as part of those conversations, I make it clear, look, I'm a researcher. And in terms of our research, it could go for you or it could go against you. I don't know. But what we want to do is to work with you, and we're going to have an impact plan that means if it does go your way, we'll work with you to achieve those impacts. And if it doesn't, we'll let you know as soon as possible so that you can manage the negative impacts on your cause. And we'll be working with your opponents, and we've got an impact plan with them as well. And I think that transparency engenders trust, which means that at the end of the day, it's going to go one way or the other. And half of these guys are going to hate you, but actually they don't hate you anymore because they see, you know what, this was legitimate, it was open, it could have gone either way. You worked with us to protect our interests nonetheless. And you know what, yeah, we'll work with you on that next project. How to reframe things to get over that not in my backyard or not in my term of office scenario. I'm not even sure if I can answer that, but it looks like Harriet has got an answer. Economic growth is vulnerable to future disasters. You can always offer ways to mitigate risks. Yeah. So this actually, thanks Harriet for getting me started on this actually. So what I actually do in that scenario is that I'm using my 3I analysis in this kind of multi-layered way. So ultimately, I want to benefit these groups in society. And so with that third I, the impact one, I'm looking at who are the groups who will benefit most and how can we ensure that we'll benefit them. At the same time, I've got MPs, civil servants, ministers, etc. as part of my analysis. I'm asking, actually, what is the actual impact, the benefit for them? Actually, for a minister, the benefit for them is often political. So I'm asking, what is the win-win where we can do something that achieves that core impact for the people I ultimately care about, but what would also be some kind of a short-term political win for that minister? And that was then the rationale around, well, yeah, Brexit is a problem for hill farming. Here's the evidence. And so how about this as a fix for that problem and a way of putting more money into hill farmers' pockets that helps your case for Brexit at the same time. And that's kind of uncomfortable for me as someone who voted against Brexit. But in terms of our cause, well, that is legitimate. The evidence points very clearly that way. If Brexit is going to happen, here's a way that you might mitigate some of those impacts. And great, now we've got some self-interest involved. And ultimately, in my view, those means justify the end if we ultimately, as a result, get a decision that protects the climate and nature. Your question, I guess, is to ask, do the means justify the ends? And of course, the answer is not always. And feel free to draw that line elsewhere. So much more it could look at. So thanks for all the great chat. And I'm going to move on at this point, if I may. And we're going to have a look now at some actual policy products, as I'm going to call them. So we've got policy briefs, infographics, presentations, and of course, presentations can be used in slideshow, so slides conversion. So here's just a slide deck. Go look at that. Or in presentation mode. And so you can see, if you look into this in your own time, you've got notes to accompany the slides, because the slides often don't have a lot of information on them if they've been used in presentation mode. So firstly, and very briefly, what is a policy brief? For us, at least, as researchers, this should be a summary or synthesis of research evidence, not only your own that is targeted, that is action-oriented, and you can do this yourself. Many of the examples in that Dropbox folder are things that have been made in Microsoft Word and PowerPoint by researchers, but let's make them nice and credible in terms of the design if we can. For me, this is something that I'll often do after I submitted evidence to a consultation, because who knows, I may be one of 20, 30,000 consultation responses, and I may get lost in the noise. If this is publicly funded research, ultimately, that has a clear answer, I want to make sure that at least the relevant team has seen that evidence. Whether they use it or not is up to them. And a policy brief is a great way to then take those key messages and target them to the relevant team. I may use that as a visual aid in a talk. I may integrate other projects within my policy brief. I may do kind of a curated series of webinars, or get everyone together in London or in Cardiff or wherever for a seminar, and have a few people working together on this. Infographics are really nice and adaptable. You can use them as a standalone. You can integrate them into your slides. You can put them on social media to drive traffic to your policy brief or slideshow. And you'll see in the book lots of guidance on how to do that very quickly and easily, with no budget or design skills required. So a lot more accessible than you might think. And also in the book, a lot more critical thinking about what can go wrong when we start converting things to graphics and simplify and make a bunch of assumptions. So the key thing is that I've chosen 3 policy products that can integrate, and so that they're nice and efficient. And we're keeping these under review, because actually, as I see how this lands, I see how people misunderstand, I see the questions people have, I can start to revise and to improve this. So we've got another breakout session. It's going to be another 12-minute one, and I'm going to invite you to choose a policy product. As a few of you don't have access to Dropbox, if you just stay in the main room, I'll put them into the chat as files for you. If you didn't look at anything over the break, I'm going to suggest that you look at the policy infographics, because you can just look at them very quickly. And your question is very simply, what do you like or dislike about what you have seen, and why? And to point people to the file so they can go and find it on Dropbox. But easier than that, if you don't mind, is to actually share your screen, so that people can see, yeah, that's what I loved about this policy brief, and yeah, bring it up on screen, share it as you're speaking. We'll do relatively small groups again, but the key thing here is that I want you to, ideally you've all looked at different things. So the idea is that you can get a sense across the board, even though you've only had a look at one thing. And I prefer quality, depth rather than breadth, please. So if you start looking at one and you all pile in and have a great discussion, great. But maybe you all get a chance, entirely up to you. So 12 minutes, you've got a 2-minute countdown, and then, a 2-minute warning on the top of your screen, and then a 1-minute countdown. And in the chat, again, just in case you forget, your question is, what do you like or dislike, and why? And we'll build up some collective advice based on this at the end. Great. So welcome back, everyone. How did you get on? So in the chat, I would love to get your tips, do's, don'ts, things you loved, things you hated and would avoid. If you can write in front of it, if it was a policy brief you're commenting on, or an infographic or presentation. And we're going to build up this advice between us. And of course, I've got lots of advice in the book, a number of chapters on each of these different techniques, tools, etc., and many more besides, in fact. So I'm not going to bore you with lots of me talking. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are, and we'll just see where that goes for now before a few concluding thoughts and a concluding exercise. Great. So Alma asking if there's any word limit, minimum or maximum, presumably for the policy briefs. And no, not really. But a rule of thumb is that the higher up the policy chain you go, so we're going to kind of MPs, politicians, ministers and the like, the simpler and the shorter it needs to be. If you're working with policy analysts, evidence analysts, people often who've got PhDs, then actually quite a lot of detail could be useful for them. So there's not a right answer, but it depends on your audience, I would argue. Great, thanks, Neve. It's about using visual metaphors, adding to your message, and as I said, a whole chapter in the Research Impact Handbook on that, but also lots of advice on how to write infographic heavy presentations and such like. Also in my third part of the book, Practical Policy Impact. How few of the infographics using stats, figures, some of them are too text heavy, some of them are quite hard to follow. So there's some good examples and some not so good examples. Lots of them can go wrong in terms of just how much you have to leave out and how much is therefore left to the imagination. So yes, less is more for an infographic, but as a researcher, I will typically want to have that infographic, but then use it in a policy brief and in a presentation and such like. So something about how professional this looks in terms of color clashes, easy to read fonts. Get a bit of help. There will be someone in your team or your university who can give you some guidance on this. And it's surprising, some organizations you'd think better of, and you think, wow, really? And it makes you question, is this credible information? Because it doesn't look credible. So it's really important not to undermine it. So many great ideas. I'm going to share all of my slides. And of course, you have the book to go into where I've got lots more specific guidance on how to structure your a policy brief, what kind of things you might want to think about in terms of content and design. None of it rocket science, but when you know what you're doing, it's surprising what a difference this can make to the quality, but also to the impact. What I want to conclude with instead is to come back to these deeper thoughts, because for me, the reason that we've done that deep thinking is that's the stuff that is worthy of discussion, worthy of thought. All of this practical stuff you can learn. And increasingly, there are online tools that can help you with this stuff. But how we actually use these policy products really matters. So the informers amongst us are likely to be wanting to send them to policy teams, but in a targeted way using that 3I analysis and framed in a way that's going to resonate for those people. The influencers amongst us might want to use these in more two-way meetings and webinars. The critical friends and campaigners may actually send these products to the media at the same time. Whereas for the brokers amongst us, it's about researching and covering all of the options, being as comprehensive as we can. And for the collaborators, which is where I will finish, you may want to co-produce your policy products. So I'm thinking here about the policy brief, which is often my starting point, and then I'll add in the infographics, do the presentation to support it. But the key thing I want to highlight here is that we start not with, I want to make a policy brief. We start with who is relevant. I do my 3I analysis. I talk to those people. And based on what they tell me, I'm now identifying the things that I'm going to be writing about in my policy brief. I reach out to them. I talk to them based on what I've learned in that 3I analysis. And as a result of that information, I can get my content right. I may use a bit of jargon, but it's policy jargon, or it's the jargon that these people will recognize, and they can help stress test drafts. tell me how this is going to land for people like them. As a result, quite often I then decide maybe I'm going to do a slightly different version of this. So I'm going to leave you, this is just a worked example of this, leave you with a question. How do you identify your red lines? And I want to get you to think now about how comfortable you feel about actually doing some of the things we've talked about today, whether that's writing a policy brief or a seminar presentation and actually standing in front of some real people, putting pen to paper, designing something, putting that out there. And if you feel uncomfortable about that, then great. Ask yourself why. Where is that coming from? And therefore, no, I'm not ready for that yet. What is my next step? And what you're doing here is you're creating a mindfulness muscle, because very often that sense of discomfort is something that we need to magnify and enlarge. And in addition to working out where our comfort zone is, we can also work out where our red lines are, because you know what, that question, there's something in that. I can't quite work it out, but you know what, I'm not answering that. I'm going to get back to you with that. And so using this and practicing this, we become more adept at navigating controversies, not falling into traps, and we go safer, we go more slowly, we take a more responsible approach. Sadly, our time is up. I'm very happy to stay around for questions, but just want to highlight that we have more free courses coming up. You'll get my slides, you'll get this video that I've recorded, a whole load of other resources, the books, the discount code in an email after today's session. Also, this is a course which you can book. So just go to the Fast Track Impact website. So if you would like, I can take this to your university. Fast Track Impact, if you've not worked out yet, we are merging with the Institute of Methods Innovation from January. So I've got a small number, I can count them on one hand at the moment, of training slots left for me in November and December. And then from there on, we'll be working with our new trainer, Eric Jensen, who is equally, like me, an expert in his field, an academic and trainer. And you will be in very safe hands with Eric. So do get in touch if you think you can, if you want, if you think I can help you with some training. Otherwise, enjoy your afternoon and your lunch and stay in touch.